that was really cool. That feels really good. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Screen Tested. I am your host Tyrant, and in today's episode we're going to be tackling a project that I have had on my mind for years, literally years. Now, as you can see on the table here, we have a lot of lightsaber hilts. I've made a lot of lightsaber hilts in my time, especially on my second channel. And today's lightsaber hilt that I want to take a look at and modify and make it a little bit unique is Dooku's, Count Dooku's from obviously the prequels, right? And it is one of, not the only, but it was certainly probably the first curved lightsaber hilt. As you can see, I have a pretty good replica here. It's also one of my favorite designs. It's just a beautiful, elegant design in general. And I made one of these a couple of years ago, and ever since then I have wanted to see how this thing would go as an actual sword handle, because obviously it's curved, right? It's a little bit different than a straight lightsaber hilt. Now, the reason why this is an interesting concept, at least to me, is because obviously a lightsaber and a sword are two completely different things. First off, these are round, they're made out of metal, and you don't really have good edge alignment with them because you don't need that with a lightsaber. So when it comes to a sword though, you have literally the opposite of all those things. You have indexing, you have a primary and secondary edge depending on what blade you have, and also the material is not metal. It's usually like a wood handle with maybe a leather or cord wrap or something like that, right? So a sword and a lightsaber hilt are actually kind of really far apart from each other. So what happens when you smash them together and turn a lightsaber into a sword? Is it a good sword? Well, that's what I want to find out in today's episode. Now, in terms of the only hilt that I could choose for today's project, I mean, I do have my custom Graflex here that I absolutely love. I also have one of my favorite clan hilts, which is the Plo Koon, Luminara Unduli, and Mace Windu's. However, the Dooku saber is just one of my favorites. Genuinely, it's a beautiful, elegant design, and I thought it was perfect for today's episode. And of course, you also get the signature look of superiority as a bonus. So the Dooku hilt is what I'm going with for today's sword project. So when it comes to the Dooku lightsaber hilt, I actually made this on my second channel a couple of years ago now. I'm going to let some of that build footage play so you can see how I did it. Now, honestly, the Dooku hilt, even back then, was the worst lightsaber hilt that I've ever made. In terms of like quality, all my other hilts that I made were so much better. This one was the worst, just because it was so difficult to make. It has a lot of complex geometry, complex curves. I remember when I tried to get the curve in the hilt itself, I ended up smashing the machined aluminum pieces I made with a sledgehammer just to get that very slight, subtle curve. It was kind of a mess, but I did think that it was perfect for today's episode simply because when I made this hilt, I made it a little bit thinner and a little bit shorter than I would a regular hilt because I felt that it fit that style, which obviously is good for a sword hilt, especially when you compare it to a regular lightsaber hilt. So with that being said, let's get to the present day. Now, when it came to actually finding a blade for this project, it was a little bit difficult because I wanted to originally use a rapier blade, but rapiers are very expensive and the blades you get might not be the best quality. So I opted to go a different route. I wanted the blade to be the same sort of general dimensions as a lightsaber blade. I found this blade that was around 1 inch in width, and it was around the length of a lightsaber hilt. On top of that, it was quite light, it had a good balance, and it had a reasonable tang. So it was the perfect candidate for this project. So to fit the blade into the lightsaber hilt, because obviously they are not supposed to go together, I just used a bunch of epoxy and some screws to the tang to get it to work. This is not my finest work at all, but it should functionally work, I hope. Then after the top portion is finished, I had to move on to the lower portion. Now, the lower portion is honestly just a nightmare. It was a nightmare to build. It's a nightmare now to try and fit it to a sword. It's just a lot of little individual pieces. So the best option, you guessed it, is just a whole bunch of epoxy again. I'm not proud of this, but if it works, it works. I then of course sharpened up the blade, ready for some cutting. And with that being said, let's get out there and see how this thing actually performs. I'm really excited about today's episode. This one is a real passion project for me. So here I have my Dooku sword. Like I said earlier, this one is kind of just a weird one. I've just had this project in mind for the last 2 years, and I really wanted to do it. It turned out pretty good. Like, it's not perfect, obviously. My original saber is a little bit, there's some problems with it. But in terms of an actual sword, it feels pretty good. It's pretty solid too. So when I move it around, like, there's something special about holding like a lightsaber hilt and then at the same time having it be a sword. It's very strange, and I kind of really dig it. Now, there are a couple of detriments when it comes to having like an actual lightsaber hilt as a sword handle. First and foremost, it's made out of metal. Now, it's made out of aluminum as well. This is one of those things that's kind of hard to get over to people, but when you actually use like a lightsaber handle on your regular hands for long periods of time, it gets very metallic type of sweat, and it starts to rash on your hand. It's quite uncomfortable. It's not really a good thing. There's a lot of detriments to it, so that's why I'm going to be wearing gloves. Now, the other issue when it comes to using a lightsaber hilt as a sword handle is that it's round, so my indexing and my edge alignment is kind of strange, but how to put this in a way that I've used enough swords that I should still be able to perfectly be able to cut with it, even with a round handle. It's just not optimal. It's just not optimal, right? So let's get to some cutting. Let's see how this thing feels. I can't explain how much I like this. This is a really strange sort of, it's a very strange sensation to be able to use a blade like this. So let's do some cuts. I hope that it'll also be able to make it through some stuff. Now, there's obviously some interesting things here because the Dooku saber it's a curved saber, but the funny thing is where most people use it, even where Dooku himself used it, is up sort of here, where it actually doesn't have that much of a curve to it. So you kind of just hold it out more like a regular sword, so it should cut, in theory, like a regular sword. That was really cool. There's not many things that I get excited about these days, but that was f***ing sick. Let me do another one. This is, I don't know how to explain it, but there's just something very, very fun about like a lightsaber, even though it's not a real lightsaber obviously, but there's something very fun about a lightsaber, quote unquote, that can cut rather than just a plastic tube. Funny story, I was actually worried when I was sharpening up the blade that it wasn't sharp enough and that it wasn't going to be able to cut. Turns out I was completely wrong. Oh, that one got away from me. That feels really good. You can tell by the giant fucking grin on my face. This is actually a whole lot cooler than even I originally thought it was gonna be. I was like, yeah, maybe it'll feel good, maybe it'll kind of cut good, but honestly, I'm really happy with this one. Yeah, it's kind of weird to move it around because it's so round. But apart from that, that felt incredible. Next thing to test, thrusting on whatever the f you want to call this. Call it whatever you want, I don't care. On this thing. That was pretty nice. And you got to keep in mind that this isn't even a proper like sword hilt, right? So it obviously doesn't feel like a regular sword hilt. Whoops. Went a bit too far there. So let's talk about this curve. Because like I said, Dooku's saber is a little bit interesting in that it's one of the first curved lightsabers. Obviously, how you use it is usually they're holding it here where there is less aggressive a curve and it's down here. Now obviously the lore behind that with Christopher Lee is that I'm pretty sure he was a fencer and fencing hilts are a little bit different. You kind of pistol grip them or whatever. This one, you don't really pistol grip this one too much because even when he's using it in the films, he's using it up here. You want more leverage, right? However, I don't think that this curve is completely useless either. Let me explain. So, when it comes to using like a sword, lightsaber, whatever, let's say I'm using it with my two hands like this. I can use it in the one hand, like a regular blade, but then if I want to two-hand it, I also have the ability to two-hand it. Completely valid. what I do like about this, and this may be just a me thing, right? But cheating my range, if we want to call it that. So if I was to thrust, and I was to thrust the blade like this, right? If I thrust it with my offhand, not only am I able to thrust it, but I kind of have a stopper. So it's going to stop because it's got that curve there. So if I wanted to extend out my range, it's really comfortable to use it like that. And that's something that I think is really, really cool about it. And let's say I want to cheat my range, all of a sudden, just like that. No problemo. So the curve itself, I've got no problem with, and especially since it's not on my main hand, it's on my secondary hand, I don't have too much of an issue with it. The biggest issue with the curve on the Dooku hilt, because like I said, sometimes the curve can be a little bit more pronounced, sometimes it can be a little bit less, is the actual dynamic of where the blade is. Because on my version it's relatively straight, on other ones it's a little bit different. The blade kind of angle is different, and I think that would be a little bit strange and harder to get used to. However, on my version, it's awesome. I got no problem with it. Wasn't perfect. Nobody's perfect. I don't think I made the tip sharp enough to get through that armor. Like, it's still a tip and it can still puncture most things, but I don't think it's going to get through Tony's armor. So the one thing that I want to do really, really quickly was compare this sword to a actual like lightsaber, right? What's the difference in terms of the thicknesses and dimensions and whatnot? So here I've got a Kit Fisto lightsaber replica, and as you can see, it's actually quite thick. This is around 38 millimeters thick. So you can see in my hand, it's a bit of a chonkster. In terms of the blade, this is a 1-inch diameter. Now, when it comes to the sword blade, I was trying to look for one that would kind of match the dimensions of a regular lightsaber, at least in terms of its width. So in terms of the blade, they're kind of very, very similar in terms of their length. That gives you kind of just a bit of a reference point on how big and how skinny this lightsaber is compared to like a regular lightsaber you would buy. So there's not going to be a tit score for this one, simply because it's kind of a mishmash of things. It's not really anything. It's just kind of a project that I was really, really fascinated by. And it took me a long time to do it, not because I just didn't have the resources to do it. It was more just like I didn't have the time. I finally got around to doing it now. I'm really happy because I've had this hilt that I made years ago at this point, and it just took a while finding the right blade that I thought would complement this hilt perfectly, and I think this blade is a good example. I was going to go with a rapier blade, but they're a lot more expensive, so I didn't. Now, when it comes to this saber, I really like it. I like Dooku's saber, and as a sword hilt design, I think it's really good. Now, there are a couple of things here that I think I have to mention that worked in its favor, and that being the way that I made this hilt. First off, I made it a much more comfortable thickness and length. Usually like an actual Dooku saber is a little bit bigger than this. It's like maybe out to here, and it's also a lot thicker. With this one, it's quite thin and nimble and light, essentially. So they all worked in the favor of this thing because I think they work really well as sword elements, hence why I wanted to do this. So in terms of this particular design, indexing and edge alignment will probably be like the biggest issues that I would run into with this particular, like taking a saber and turning it into a sword. But there's also the other issue of, like I said earlier, just how your sweat and hands kind of react to like aluminum as a sword material after long extended periods of time. You do get like rashes on your hands. They go all red and they smell like metal. It's not really pleasant. That's usually why we use other materials on sword handles. So when it comes to something like this, it's really cool for this sort of thing, and I like it, but I wouldn't use it as like an everyday carry type thing. It's not that I would take it into battle. But it's really cool, and I think this one turned out rather well. And not only did it turn out rather well, it worked. Really, it worked like a regular sword, which, I mean, I shouldn't be surprised at that. I've made swords before, but I'm always surprised sometimes when things don't go terrible. But that's going to be all for today's episode, guys. I genuinely hope you enjoyed. Remember to like and subscribe if you haven't already. And if you want to support this channel and this type of content, you can become a Patreon down below. There'll be links in the description to support the channel. With all that being said, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you next week in another episode. Have a good one.